Welcome back, and we are coming to you from the World Economic Forum here in Davos, Switzerland, and I am talking now with the President of Poland, President Karol Nawrocki, joining us right now. Mr. President, thanks very much for sitting down with me.
Thank you for having me. Great pleasure.
Yes, and it is our pleasure. One of the biggest dominating conversations here in Davos is President Trump's plans to acquire Greenland, and I want to get your take on it, given that Poland is one of NATO's front-line states as Ukraine aid, as Russia deterrence, and, of course, as U.S. troop posture are all under pressure. What is your reaction to the president's plans to acquire Greenland and his plans to put tariffs on European nations until he gets that support?
First of all, we have to be aware of the fact that the Greenland issue is not a new one. It started back in the 19th century, and today Greenland is of strategic importance. Well, of course, this issue needs to be solved with respect for international order within NATO allies, and I believe that this issue will be solved by President Trump in relations with Denmark. I'm looking at Greenland as a place, one of the places, around which there is also a certain strategic geopolitical shift going on. President Donald Trump is a leader of the free world, of the democratic world, of the civilization to which Poland also belongs, cares about security of the Western Hemisphere, but he also cares for the security of the entire world, of the values and democracy, and he tries to solve this issue. I believe that allies will solve this issue through diplomatic channels, and this is what we are striving for.
I mean, after all, you just saw Russia send drones into Poland, and we were all wondering, what does this mean? So do you see Greenland as that kind of protection? Should the U.S. be able to be successful here as averting potential missiles into the Western Hemisphere?
If we look at the distribution of funds concerning responsibility for security, then the United States spends 65% of GDP, where the European Union 35%. President Donald Trump is a leader of certain stability and security in the world and on the eastern flank of NATO, of course, in agreement and in partnership with Europe. And we need to understand that certain strategic steps around Greenland are done, thinking about constant pressure exerted by the Russian Federation. Yes, as you have just said, we know Russian pressure on our borders. Poland, as a matter of fact, is in the middle of a hybrid war for many years, and today security-related questions are most important for the free world, and in this context we should be looking at Greenland and at steps done by President Donald Trump. These steps are made also for the security in Europe, across the globe, and also in Poland.
You are balancing strong nationalism in Poland and with EU demands on courts, on migration, of course, and on energy policy. What can you tell us about that tension between Poland and the European Union right now?
We want to be part of the European Union, but the tensions which you are mentioning are visible. We in Poland attach biggest importance to the Polish constitution. We are not advocates of centralization of the European Union. We're not interested in ideological issues in Poland in terms of certain policies of the European Union. We are concerned within the democratic system. We can talk about it. We are concerned about the trends which speak about the Green Deal. We are concerned about certain overregulation of the European bureaucracy. And this is a healthy discussion which we're having within the European Union. We can raise those issues which we do not like, but at the same time, we are a member of the European Union. The world today needs a strong United States, who is a leader, who is the strongest state in the world, and we need a good cooperation with the European Union.
Well, I mean, there is some debate about stepping up militarily in terms of Ukraine. And I want to get your take on where this is standing right now, the war on Ukraine, the impact on Poland, and most importantly, what happens next if the U.S. and the Europeans slow down their support for Ukraine? Is Poland ready to step up militarily?
Oczywiście Polacy nie są gotowi do tego,
Poles are not ready to send troops to Ukraine. However, Poland has been supporting Ukraine right from the start of the attack of the Russian Federation on Ukraine. We have been supporting Ukrainians. Let me remind you, 96% of all global donations, including humanitarian aid and military aid, goes through the Jasionka airport in Poland, in the Podkarpackie region. So we can see that militarily, without the support of the United States, without the solidarity of the European Union, and without huge commitment of the Polish infrastructure, Ukraine is not ready. Although big sacrifice of the soldiers, Ukraine would not be able to survive, and this is the basic support which Ukraine is getting. But today Poland is not ready to send its troops there, but it is ready to continue its support for Ukraine. On the strength and the position of the United States is also based on American equipment, which is the best in the world. We have bought it, we spent 60 billion to buy that equipment, and we still need it. So what we need prudence. The efforts of President Donald Trump are supposed, I think, to awaken some part of Europe and tell Europe it is security, not ideology. Relations with the United States and a strong transatlantic alliance is something which is most important today for the world.
Was, I believe, one of the first, if not the first, European nation to go to 5% or close to 5% of your GDP on defense spending. Do you believe that the United States should expect European allies to spend more and faster on defense?
In Poland, we have achieved almost 5% of GDP, and also the Baltic states are following into our footsteps. These are smaller countries in our region, and they can also feel responsibility for their own security. I believe this is a big success achieved by President Donald Trump. The fact that he made this demand from Europe, that he demanded that Europe take responsibility for its own security. We in Poland are not only recipients of security, but we are also ready to pay to make sure that Europe as a whole is safe and secure. And that is why we are allocating close to 5% of GDP on defense, on the military. And if you're asking me whether this is a good direction, yes, I believe that President Donald Trump has the right to expect that the American effort in the defense of the values which are close to us also requires mobilization of the European countries so that in the face of war, which is there in Europe, not in the United States, in the face of the aggression of the Russian Federation, that they should increase their defense spending up to 5% of GDP.
You are also meeting with President Trump here in Davos. What specifically does Poland want from the United States in this next phase of U.S. leadership? Do you want troops, weapons? Do you want energy, trade? What specifically are you looking for?
First of all, we've got almost 10,000 American troops stationed in Poland. I would like to welcome them very warmly. I always stress that this is the first time in the history of Poland when Poles are happy because they are able to cooperate with foreign troops on the territory of Poland. This is the first time in Polish history that it has happened this way. Well, of course, we want to maintain the number of U.S. troops in Poland. It is President Donald Trump who made such a promise, and he kept his word. We're ready to build Fort Trump in Poland. This Fort Trump is being prepared in Poland right now, in the city of Bolesławiec in Lower Silesia. This is something that Poland needs today. On the one hand, we need the support of our allies, we need the presence of U.S. troops. But on the other hand, let me stress once again, we are creating best possible conditions for those soldiers. We are paying for U.S. troops. We see the United States as our partner, and knowing that we also pay money for U.S. troops stationed in our country. And of course, we're buying American equipment, which is state-of-the-art, the best in the world.
Who do you believe should lead Europe if Germany and France hesitate?
I believe that we should be looking for a leader in the European Union among those countries which have made no mistake in their security strategy. If we look since 2008, 2010, they have been talking about Russian threat. So we should be looking for a leader among those countries which have not made a mistake in climate policy, who have made no mistakes in migration policy, who have not let in illegal migrants into their countries. So I'm convinced that a new leader of the European Union should should grow in Eastern and Central Europe, should be there in cooperation with our partners in Paris and in Berlin. This is the high time that in the strong transatlantic relations we should give the voice also to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe who have so far made no mistake and who want to take responsibility for our security.
Very, very important point. Final question here. You've said this. You said borders matter, whether in Eastern Europe or the United States. What can the U.S. learn about your control of your border in Poland?
Myślę, że mamy tutaj podobną
I think we
historię.
have got a similar history in this respect, ladies and gentlemen and madam, because we have got this barrier on the border, a blockade on the border with Belarus. Belarus was trying to let into Poland illegal migrants with different strength, with different dynamism. Of course, a state border is sacrosanct, both in the United States and in Poland. Crossing the border of the Republic of Poland will always be met with a reaction of Polish soldiers, Polish armed forces. We treat our borders as sacrosanct. We are part of NATO. I would like to thank our partners and our allies who, when Russian drones violated Polish airspace on the 10th of September last year, they kept this allied character and they helped us to react. We need to be strong as NATO. We need to respond to every violation of the border. And I believe that the United States is also doing their job.
Okay, let me end where I began, and that is the NATO alliance, because many people are worried right now about that alliance, given President Trump's tariffs on European nations until he gets the support from European leaders. Are you worried? What is your take on the NATO alliance, and what is your response to President Trump on Greenland?
Certainly, I'm the President of Poland. I'm looking at the United States as our main partner, but also the main motto of the North Atlantic Alliance. I'm looking at NATO as the biggest and the strongest alliance in the history of the world and in the history of the 20th century. There is no other perspective in Poland. So on the side of Europe, there is also this responsibility. There have been certain agreements made with President Donald Trump, and Donald Trump has the right, because he's the main contributor in the North Atlantic Alliance, he has the right to demand bigger involvement of the European countries. We are doing our job in Poland. On the other hand, he has the right to see that places such as Greenland are strategic. I fully understand the responsibility of the United States and certain consistency of President Donald Trump, and I believe that our European leaders will make an agreement with President Trump that Europe will be safe and that Russia will not pose a direct kinetic threat to Europe.
Mr. President, President Trump asked you to be on his peace board for Gaza. Will you accept?
This is a big distinction for Poland, of course, and for me, as for the President of Poland, that President Donald Trump sent this invitation to me. I wanted to have a personal discussion with him and tell him how important this invitation is for Poland. Polish political system, Polish democratic system looks in the following way. International agreements are signed in cooperation with the Polish government. I'm in touch with the Polish Prime Minister. I have sent a message to him telling him that I have received this invitation, and for Poland, for sure, this is a big distinction and honor.
Well, we'll be watching and waiting for that conversation between you and President Trump. We so appreciate your time this morning. Thanks very much, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Have a great day.
President Nawrocki. We'll be right back.